Hi, this is Patrick Sullivan. Welcome to my shop. Today we're making handles. In the previous videos, we shaped several blades and then heat treated them to produce hard and resilient cutters. Next, we need to put handles on them. What style of handle? Well, there are lots of choices, and for the most part the decision is purely personal. All the choices I'm going to show will function well. Starting with the simplest, we could just insert the blade into a dowel or a scrap of wood and round the edges a little with a rasp or sandpaper. This works, but we can do better than this. When I make tools with blades that cut on their sides, like knives, I make rectangular handles and then sometimes shape them just as knife makers do. You can put this same kind of handle on a chisel made with round stock as well. A popular tradition with smaller tools in the past was the short, fat ball handle. My father gave me this set of carving tools with this style handle when I was 12, and I have decades of experience with them. Although these chisels have great sentimental value, I'm not very fond of this style in general, in part because they don't fit my large hands very well. Many chisels in the past were made with octagonal sides, like this fishtail chisel I picked up in a garage sale 30 years ago. The plus of this shape is that the tools don't roll off your work surface when you set them down. We will make a simple version of this style that can be made with nothing but a block plane and a chisel. By far the majority of chisels have handles turned on a lathe. An important reason is that a skilled turner can produce a finished handle in just a few minutes. We will make several handles in this fashion just to show how fast and efficient this process is. Surprisingly, you don't even have to own a real lathe. I made about a dozen such handles with a very simple device that's driven by an electric drill with a rudimentary tailstock and tool rest that simply clamped to my workbench. This turned out to be so much fun that I eventually bought a small, inexpensive lathe, which is even more fun. My view on size is that the finished handle needs to be about 5 inches long. However, you ought to make this custom chisel fit your hand. Place your hand palm up. Close your hand not into a fist, but into a grip for a chisel. The finished length needs to be from the tip of your thumb to the bottom of your little finger, plus a little extra for the rounded end of the handle. Add the length of the ferrule, and that is your length. The thickness of the handle is also a matter of personal preference and hand size. I have made some as thin as 5/8 inch, and they work, but they feel a little skimpy in my large hands. I prefer ones that are about 7/8 inch at the fattest point. Okay, let's move on to actually cutting wood. I'm making my blanks 1 inch square. Remember that if you plan to turn the handle on a lathe, you should leave a little extra at both ends for the lathe to grip. I cut the blanks to 6 inches for a 5-inch finished length. Mark the center of both ends and start a hole with an awl or a nail to guide the drill bit to the exact center. Don't try to balance the handle at one end and rely on your steady hand to keep it upright and aligned. I made a simple jig that does the trick. I squared up 2 small blocks from some scrap construction lumber. The handle nestles in the corner where the 2 blocks are glued together. The hole in the end for the blade needs to be centered and straight. If the hole angles by even 3 or 4 degrees from the vertical, it will be painfully obvious when you put the blade in. I don't trust my eye to drill this straight, so I use a drill press. We want to embed the blade to a depth of 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 inches. Notice how the little tape flag I attached to the top of the drill bit sweeps away the sawdust on the top of the handle blank when the drill reaches its exact correct depth. If you don't have access to a drill press, you can make a simple drilling guide, like this or some variation of it, to keep the bit vertical. Turning the handle on a lathe. I like turned handles for the graceful shapes you can easily achieve. I will demonstrate the process I use. I'm a relative novice at wood turning and I'm self-taught, so don't think you're going to learn any wonderful tricks from me. I'm doing this primarily to show you how someone with very limited skills can make a really good-looking handle in just a few minutes. I start by turning a cylinder, real basic stuff. Once round, I mark the dimensions on the handle of the cylinder. I use a parting tool to make cuts at the two ends. I then turn the ferrule, leaving it slightly oversized at this point. I then turn a cove at the narrowest part of the handle. I want to create a real shoulder here for my fingers to push on. Next, I taper the short segment closest to the ferrule. Finally, I shape the butt end. And then taper the fat portion of the handle down to meet the cove. The only criteria is that the shape looks good to you. I go back over this sometimes several times to try to smooth all the lines to a pleasing shape. Next, I sand with 150 grit paper. Sanding is very fast on the lathe. Once smooth and free of defects, I switch to 220 grit. When all the scratches are gone, I give it a quick once-over with 320. It should now be ready for finish. I'm going to use Zinsser Seal Coat, which is pure wax-free shellac. Tape the ferrule to avoid getting finish on it. You'll see that a few quick wipes with shellac will seal the wood. I dilute the shellac with alcohol, about 2 parts of de-waxed shellac to 1 part isopropyl or methyl alcohol. This mixture will dry on the lathe in seconds, allowing you to put on 3 to 4 coats in about 2 minutes. You can actually watch it dry. Let it dry more thoroughly for about 30 minutes or more so that it gets hard, and then rub it down with a gray 3M pad. You can also use steel wool. All you're doing here is removing any wood fibers that stick up or any dust that was caught up in the finish. The pad will leave the handle silky smooth. Then I put on another 2 coats. The handle should now be well sealed and can be used as is. However, if you want maximum durability, add a coat of polyurethane or acrylic directly over the shellac. Let's try an octagon next. Before we make the handle, we first need to make a simple jig to hold the blank for planing. Cut a strip of 3/4 inch MDF about 7 to 8 inches long and about 2 to 3 inches wide. Rip it down the center with the blade tilted to 45 degrees. Now we reposition those 2 strips and glue them to a base piece of MDF. Finally, glue a small triangular offcut at one or both ends to serve as a planing stop. While the glue is curing, be sure to drill the hole for the blade while your blank still has nice straight sides. If you don't, you've made your work a lot harder. A very ordinary block plane will cut the octagon facets rapidly and smoothly. It took me just a little over 3 minutes to turn this square shape into an octagon. Small chisels, like we are making, really call for a tapered handle. It would be possible to make tapering jigs and templates, but none of that is essential. We can do the tapering with the plane by eye. When the handle has about the right shape, take a chisel or a sharp carving knife and round the butt end. Take your time and just remove thin layers that you can manage safely. The front end needs to be relieved a little too. Just bevel the edges to remove their sharpness. I like this handle. It is plenty smooth enough as it comes from the plane, and it doesn't need any sanding. I'm also not going to put any finish on it. Many traditional tools were handled with bare wood in the past. After a while, oil from your hands will give it a patina that cannot be duplicated by anything that comes out of a can or a bottle. Gluing the blade and the ferrule. Setting the blades in the handle takes only a few seconds. First, test the fit of the blade into the hole. If it's so snug that you cannot insert it easily, then ream the hole a little with the bit. Just run the bit in and out several times with a little pressure on the sides. Mix 5-minute epoxy thoroughly. And introduce a small amount into the hole. Wipe a thin coating of epoxy around the inside of the hole. Do not fill the hole up. The blade will act like a piston, and too much epoxy will prevent it from seating itself deep in the hole. If you design the handle for a ferrule, then get the tubing ready. I buy 3/8 inch brass tubing with a wall thickness of about 14 thousandths of an inch. File or sand the end off until you get a clean square edge. Measure the length of the tubing and cut it with a tubing cutter if possible. This tool is not expensive and it produces a cut that is absolutely square and crimped inward slightly, which is a small advantage. Verify that the tenon on your handle will fit inside. It might require a little touch-up with a file. Mine here in this example is a trifle undersized, but that won't make any difference at all. I try to leave the ferrule slightly long and I fill this space with epoxy. Apply a little epoxy and press the ferrule onto the tenon. If it's a tight fit, drill a hole in a block of wood large enough to easily accommodate the blade and press the handle with the ferrule down onto the block firmly. You can also open the jaws of your vise a little and use it as a hard surface on which to press on the ferrule. Notice the epoxy on the exposed end of the tenon. It seals the wood, it looks good, and it makes a nice transition from the edge of the ferrule to the blade. Let the epoxy cure overnight. It becomes firm in about 10 minutes, depending on the temperature, but it takes many hours for it to develop real strength. Okay, that's it. Hopefully you now understand the whole process well enough to produce a wide variety of miniature and micro tools of many different shapes. And you now have a carving tool custom made to your personal design. Enjoy.